Belle DeCosta Green was born black but lived most of her life passing for white, a risky act of defiance. She was estranged from her biological father and found a father figure in her powerful employer, banker J. Pierpont Morgan. She was a studious librarian by day and a glamorous it girl by night. She was private and on the front page of newspapers. She was a spinster and rarely without romantic partners. She drank with bohemians and prayed with cardinals. She lived with her mother and crisscrossed the Atlantic without a chaperone. She was crushingly forthright and incredibly generous. Her life was full of triumph and great sorrow. She took many secrets to the grave, only for them to be revealed after her death.
Olive complexion, green eye reflection, proud black lady, but maybe not in detection. Not cause neglection, we're talking early 1900s. Her moms chose to pass, kids took direction. Belle DeCosta Green is the queen librarian. Born Marion Greener, but she went contrarian. See, her father was Harvard educated and black. In fact, the first to get that stat, so better know that.
I'm Anne-Marie, a librarian at Harvard University.
And I'm Rachael Lowell Ellison, a leadership expert and executive coach.
This is Boss Like Belle, a podcast in which I seek inspiration from the life of the legendary American librarian Belle DeCosta Green and dare myself and you to lead fearlessly like her.
Join us as we unpack the learnings and insights from the parallel lives of two Black women navigating the very white space of professional librarianship, a century apart.
Portuguese background was for Stella Mine. It also should be noted, Belle was kind of fine.
Episode 1, Belle and Me.
So let's set the stage, Anne-Marie. I remember you were sitting in my virtual office. It was our second coaching meeting for a leadership development program at Harvard. You had just taken your new role.
I'd been promoted as a department head at Houghton Library, which is Harvard's main rare books library. And to be quite honest, I was feeling a bit out of place and awkward now being the boss of my former peers and colleagues.
We started the coaching session, though. You came in with this new big idea. As you started to share it, you were literally lit up. You looked so excited.
I asked you if you'd ever heard of Belle DeCosta Green. I told you a little bit about her and then I explained my concept for this podcast. And I think I said something to you like, hey, my elevator pitch is that this podcast is to libraries what the movie Julie and Julia was to cooking.
Right. So Julie and Julia, for listeners who aren't familiar, New Yorker Julie Powell, there was a movie about this, gets through this personal time of crisis by challenging herself to prepare all 524 recipes in Julia Child's cookbook, Mastering the Art of French Cooking. And it was transformative for her. And the film sort of parallels these two lives.
From writer-director Nora Ephron.
That is good, isn't it?
Meryl Streep, Amy Adams.
I was drowning and she pulled me out of the ocean.
I think what you saw in that movie and that kind of structure was a way to learn and to grow from Belle, kind of in her absence.
What I saw in it was that just like Julie Powell, I was experiencing self-doubt and feeling a bit of an imposter really at work following my promotion. And so I realized that by daring myself to boss like Belle, historic figure who I greatly admired, it could really help me to gain in confidence and become fearless leader, just like her.
And how did you first hear of Belle DeCosta Green?
So I went to library school over 2 decades ago, and that was the first time I heard about her. At that time, she was really held up to us students, predominantly female profession, as a kind of trailblazing early female leader in her role as the first director of the Pierpont Morgan Library in New York, now called the Morgan Library Museum. And so I heard about her about 20 years ago, but it was actually only about, maybe about 10 years ago that a biography came out on her, and it revealed so much about her personal and professional life that we had no idea about before. And foremost, I was just astonished to learn that Green was Black and passing as white, and me being a Black woman, and that made me even more interested to know about her.
During Greene's lifetime, many light-skinned African Americans, such as herself, passed as white to escape the racism of Jim Crow and segregation, and to access social, economic, and political opportunities otherwise denied to them. Passing was an act of defiance and risky. Passers, such as Greene, were breaking the law. They often experienced great personal loss and lived under the constant fear of being discovered. Interesting to think about her choice to pass. How do you characterize that?
I've had mixed feelings about that over time, since, I learnt about her passing, and since I've learned more about the phenomenon of passing in the United States. So on the one hand, there were Black librarians who are contemporaries of hers who did not pass. I guess sometimes I've thought, well, is she a role model for me, right? Because she did choose that path. Mm-hmm. But as I've learned more about the phenomenon of passing, I feel like it's not my place or the place of others to judge such decisions. It was a really difficult time period for Black people when she was alive. I mean, we still have a lot of the remnants of that now, but many more barriers in place. And, a scholar who is an expert in passing, she said very wisely that actually it's an indictment on the United States that they even had these laws in the first place, and that we shouldn't see it as an indictment of individual people who made the choice to pass because they could. That's where I stand right now. I still feel like there's a lot to learn from her, even though she did make that choice.
I can't imagine thinking about that choice and how difficult it must have been.
We must remember that it was dangerous to pass. It was illegal to pass, right? So what she was doing was incredibly brave. To me, that's, really amazing example of fearlessness, because she decided to take that path and have a very, very high profile career despite this lifelong risk of being discovered. And so for me, who doesn't have to deal with those kind of laws and restrictions these days, I think, wow, if she was able to put those fears behind her and move forward 100 years ago, like, what's really stopping me?
What drew you back to Belle?
The Morgan Library and Museum in 2024, 2025, they're celebrating their 100 years as a public institution. The library had started off as a personal collection, a private collection. And so they're going to celebrate their centennial by honouring Greene as its first director. And they invited me to join this incredible all-star advisory committee, and also asked me to contribute a chapter in a new book on Greene's life and career, which will accompany the exhibition.
That's a huge honor and an opportunity for you. What were you asked to bring to that chapter?
Yeah, so they asked me to write about Greene as a medievalist. So she was an expert in medieval and Renaissance European books, and she built the most important collection of such books in America at the Morgan Library. And this is my own area of expertise too. And in fact, the professional circles that I move in now are directly descended from those that Greene occupied a century ago. If we compared Rolodexes, we'd have the same institutions in there and the same positions, but just occupied by different people. And that's because both she and I are colleagues and also close friends with many curators and librarians at all the major institutional collections in North America and Europe.
It's so interesting how much you have in common. But how have you felt as you've been researching and writing about her? Talk about the experience of that.
I went into the project focusing on this very niche, specific area of her expertise and career. But, I couldn't help myself but read around more about her life. And I was just struck by so many parallels between us. She was born in 1879 and I was born in 1979. And then I just kept on noticing other parallels too.
Share a few other similarities. I mean, the 100 years apart is a big one. Professional focus and orientation is another one. What other similarities come up?
So we both have a kind of mixture of African and European ancestry due to the transatlantic slave trade. And also we both experienced our Blackness differently in different points in our lives. And that for her, that's because the kind of shifting status of race in America. So both by law and also by the choice that she and her family made to pass as white. And then for me, I've just lived in lots of different countries in Europe and now also in the United States. And so I've just experienced my race and how the world sees and perceives me differently in those different environments. We kind of both achieving our parents' unfulfilled aspirations. So both of us had very educated, brilliant and ambitious parents whose aspirations for themselves were kind of thwarted due to racism. So, you know, her father was the first African-American man to graduate from Harvard College. And my own father, he was also like one of the early African students at the University of London as well. And they both were unable to have the careers that they deserved for their brilliance because of, you know, racism in post-Reconstruction USA and also racism in post-colonial Britain where my parents were living. The other kind of similarity I saw between us, and we touched on this a little bit, is that we're both medievalists and that we dedicate ourselves to making our collections that are in our care available to scholars and to the general public. One of the other things that really struck me about the kind of like parallel between our lives is Italy. So we both shared an enormous love of Italy, its art, its culture and language, and have experienced kind of like formative moments and relationships in that country. I mentioned briefly that her father was the first African American to graduate from Harvard College. And the connections between Belle and I and Harvard, they ran really deep. So, you know, obviously I work at Harvard Library. I've been at Harvard since 2016. But Belle also had many professional and personal ties to the university as well that span her entire adult life. We both became mothers later on in life at a point where I think neither of us expected that we would have children.
I can imagine how you must have been getting goosebumps as you were reading some of these similarities. What's important about doing this, Anne-Marie? What do you want to gain?
So I want to gain a number of things, like finding my own unique voice, communicating that to others, like both in my profession and beyond. My second goal is about inspiring others. So, you know, the field of professional librarianship is still very, very white, just as it was in Green State. It's not a diverse field. And I think that there are insights and lessons that can be learned by looking at her as an early trailblazer, but also at myself. You know, I get approached a lot by young librarians of color in the field who see me as a role model and, you know, ask me for advice. And I hope people find it inspirational.
Yeah, it's really what you're modeling, you know, sharing your story, being somewhat vulnerable, but outspoken about where you want to be in your career and the message you're hoping to share with others. Can you talk a little bit about what it feels like to be a Black librarian in this very white context? You know, how do you feel? What is feeling other? How does that play out?
Oh, that plays out in many, many different ways. Librarianship, and especially, you know, the library that I work in at an Ivy League university, that's a predominantly white environment. And so when you're like one of the few only Black and brown faces, and you're in a leadership position, so your colleagues come from the more like dominant culture, that can sometimes feel really uncomfortable. And funnily enough, that can feel more uncomfortable nowadays when there's such a focus on diversity and inclusion. Sometimes you ask yourself, or you think, oh, are my colleagues thinking that I was promoted only because I'm Black? if I'm really honest, right? So there's just the underlying feeling where you think, or maybe that's what other people are thinking.
We've talked about you want to find your voice, you want to have impact on others. What does it look like at the end of these challenges? What looks different than it does now?
I'm still myself, but someone who is bold, confident in myself, doesn't hesitate so much, doesn't second guess myself, has much greater trust in my intuition or gut feeling, and really also in my many years of expertise.
So that's a question that we'll be asking and paying attention to as we go through these different challenges, these different conversations about Belle's life, right? How did she display a really deep trust for herself, her own skills and training, and her intuition? So I want to close up our conversation by asking, when you came up with this project, you had that gut feeling. What did it feel like in your body to make this very clear decision?
So it felt scary, but like in a good way. Kind of like when you're riding on a roller coaster and you're at the top and you're about to go down and, you know, it's going to be fun. But in that moment in time, you're thinking, oh my goodness, why did I get on this thing in the first place? So yeah, it felt like right, but also scary because, to be quite frank, it's taking me out of my comfort zone. I'm very comfortable with public speaking, but I usually stick to my areas of expertise. I don't really speak about myself and my background and my history. So this is scary for me, but also extremely exciting. So I feel like I'm cresting the wave of a of a roller coaster, to mix my metaphors.
Well, let's, feel like we're at Coney Island. Let's pay attention to that feeling, that roller coaster, ride the wave feeling that you're having, and try to bring it through these series of conversations.
That's all for this first episode of Boss Like Belle. Next time, we'll be exploring how Belle inspired me to lean into mentoring and sponsoring librarians and museum workers of colour. I'll be returning to the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, where I started my career in the United States, to connect with Adrian Chaparro, the mentee I'm most proud of.
In my practice and in my future career or current career is this idea of, bringing people along with you. That's definitely what you did with me. You opened the door and I think at times grabbed my arm and yanked me in. And it's what I needed, because I feel like for anyone who is thinking about making the moves or, thinking about what they want to do, it's really scary once it starts happening. Yeah. And people, it's great when people take you serious.
It also should be noted, Belle was kind of fine.
Boss Like Belle, created by Anne-Marie Eze. Hosted by Anne-Marie Eze and Rachael Lowell Ellison. Produced by Anne-Marie Eze and Diego Senor, executive producer at La Central Podcasts. Edited by Nicole Pizarro at La Central Podcasts. Sound engineers Clayton Scoble and Brian Leach at Harvard Library. Special consultants Philip Palmer and Erica Chalela. Co-curators of the exhibition Belle de Costa Green, A Librarian's Legacy, the Morgan Library and Museum. Belle's voice is performed by Erica Chalela from the Morgan Library and Museum. The Ballad of Belle de Costa Green, composed and performed by Big Piff. All music used in this podcast comes from Pixabay.com. Cover art by Scott Murray. Photography by Stephanie Stevens. The Boss Like Belle podcast is also supported by the Morgan Library and Museum and made possible by the generous support of Harvard Library, whose commitment to fostering knowledge and research enables the sharing of ideas and scholarship within the broader community.